Hi, it's Paul. Let's look at squamous cell carcinoma and its generalised features in cytology specimens. So we'll look at the usual features and how they're expressed in SCCs. Arrangement, like in the cervix, is usually single cells, flat sheets of cells, or crowded hyperchromatic groups of cells. Also, pearls. And often you'll have a background that has a combination of necrotic debris and free keratin. This is a classic example. So we've got crowded hyperchromatic group of cells there, and then these well-differentiated keratinizing squamous cell carcinoma cells that are obviously very orange. This is just like we saw in the cervix, so there's depth of focus, poor polarity, quite dark hyperchromatic cells, whereas nuclear features of the orangiophilic cells are a lot harder to see. It's more difficult to see good malignant features in them. Often the NC ratio is fairly low. Those ones there seem to be more spindled in shape, so they're suspicious for being abnormal. But these ones you can see either have no nuclei, we call that free keratin, or they have just a pycnotic degenerate nucleus with an opaque chromogen. So two situations arise where that is difficult. If you have both of those cell groups present, then it's relatively easy to say, one, it's malignant, and secondly, that it's squamous. If you just have, for example, the basaloid cells, like this example, all you have is three-dimensional hyperchromatic crowded groups of cells, then malignancy is easy to arrive at. There's good malignant nuclear criteria here. Hyperchromasia, variation, nuclear size, etc. But it's harder to say this is definitely squamous because there is an absence really of obvious squamous differentiation. And by that I mean cytoplasmic features like orangiophilia. So the other problematic appearance is when you get just one of the cell types and it's the keratinizing well-differentiated cells. So I can tell these are squamous cells, but finding good malignant criteria is quite difficult. Many of the cells have no nucleus, or else they have a very low NC ratio and not obvious variation in nuclear size and shape and abnormal chromatin. This is particularly problematic in the neck area, where you have a lot of benign squamous line cysts that can mimic this appearance. And so we want to see cells that have good nuclear features in order to be 100% sure. And often it involves scouring around, looking through this material in order to find cells like these that have classic malignant features. And so these cells are not as keratinized. They have a high NC ratio, variable size and shape of nuclei, and prominent little nucleoli in them as well. This is especially a problem on Giemsa stain slides because the squamous cells are not lighting up bright orange. They stain a sort of bluey purple colour, which sometimes is distinctive, but actually it can be very easy to confuse with just benign mucin or cystic material, and so it can be quite problematic on air-dried Giemsa stain slides. I can see some nuclei here which is making me think squamous, and I would have to look hard to find good malignant criteria. The other thing you'll see sometimes is this arrangement, and this is a little squamous pearl. It's probably not the greatest example, but it's okay. And they are concentric keratinized cells that just wrap around each other in like a pearl formation. When you have a lot of keratin present as well, you can get almost a foreign body giant cell reaction to that, and that's what this case is showing. So we've got there on the right 2 really huge giant cells, which are macrophages with multi-nucleation, and they just eating up the keratin that's present. So cytoplasm shows variable NC ratio, sometimes quite low in those well differentiated keratinized cells. Usually, however, it's that squamoid feature of dense cytoplasm, so no vacuoles, and well-defined cell borders. Orangiophilia should be very common as well. Here's a nice example showing both keratinized single cells, crowded hyperchromatic groups, and then sheets of cells. This is the crowded hyperchromatic group showing all those features: loss of polarity, less cytoplasm, so a higher NC ratio, but more obvious nuclear abnormalities. Always look around the edges of the group, so at the very bottom there I can see a cell with a central nucleus. Pretty happy that's squamous. Then here's the sheets of cells, and we can see that even though these aren't orangiophilic, they've still got that squamoid cytoplasm, so a centrally placed nucleus. Notice the little nucleoli in a lot of these, and it's like a sheet that's reasonably cohesive and has a really well-defined cell border to it. The other thing we'll see are spindle cells. This is a little cluster of spindle cells. They have opaque, almost hyperchromatic nuclei and cigar-shaped or pointy spindled nuclei. So these can be either orangiophilic or they can be not so, as you can see on the ones on the outside here. The other thing we see are the really bizarre chordate type cells we've already looked at in the cervix. Nuclei in SCCs usually show fairly marked anisokaryosis. Remember, they're always central, round, oval, they can be spindle, hyperchromatic, and the chromatin is usually quite coarse in comparison to adenocarcinomas, and nucleoli are usually multiple, if you can see them, or sometimes the chromatin's so dark you can't see nucleoli. So these ones got quite coarse chromatin and seem to have maybe small nucleoli in them as well. They're sort of centrally placed, even though they're weirdly shaped cells. These nuclei in the hyperchromatic crowded group are showing multiple small nucleoli, fairly coarse chromatin, definitely hyperchromatic. And variation in size. Looking at the keratinized cells, you can see nuclei are really dark. That's because they're pycnotic. Sometimes they're quite angular and pycnotic, sometimes they're just round, and then in some of these cells there are no nuclei because it's just free keratin. So in summary, for SCC, the most common differential diagnoses are when the tumour is composed of, or the at least cytology sample is composed of, cells that are that more basaloid type. Then the differential diagnosis is between poorly differentiated SCC and a poorly differentiated adenocarcinoma. And the other common differential diagnosis, which I talked about in the head and neck area in particular, is with a well-differentiated SCC that's heavily keratinized with a benign squamous line cyst.